second.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been on meetings all day. I'm just going to sit here and have a cocktail.
I support this decision.
Right.
All right, do we have most folks in, or are we still waiting for a couple? I think that's probably everybody.
There's no one in the waiting room.
Thank you. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I appreciate your time. This is being hosted by the Northwest Animal Rights Network. We're a small nonprofit based in the Pacific Northwest. Can you hit the next slide, Mike? Thank you. So we just want a couple things as our little ground rules in these meetings is we do welcome all genders, sexual orientations, ages, and religions. People of, we welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian, Arab, and those who identify as Latin, Latinx, people indigenous to land, and people of mixed multiple descents, people with disabilities, invisible or visible, Native and non-Native speakers who are calling in from various cities around the United States and around the world, and people who identify as activists and people who don't. So thank you very much for everyone that has joined us. We do have an anti-harassment policy for all of our events. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do hope that everyone will take a moment to just read our policy real quick, because we do want this to be a welcoming place for everybody. Okay, next slide. And we at NARN acknowledge that here in the Seattle area, we occupy indigenous land, the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish tribe. And if you are interested in learning more about reparations, for paying the rent, please do visit the link at the bottom there, the Duwamish.org. Sorry. Okay. Next. Thank you. I think that's it. And I am very pleased to be welcoming Amy Myers of Rise for Animals. Amy became a grassroots activist in 2005, and together with other activists and organizations, she's led several successful campaigns, including the banning horse-drawn carriages from the streets of Salt Lake City, defeating Utah's ag-gag law, and ending pound seizure in Utah. So as you can tell, she's quite accomplished, and she's been spending a long time working on animal experimentation issues. So I'm really excited to have her here and for her presentation. So please do take it away, Amy. Awesome. Oh, just real quick, if people can mute themselves if you haven't already. I think everybody mostly has, just so there's no like crosstalk.
Awesome, thanks so much. I'm just gonna work on sharing my screen here with y'all. It's really great to be with the folks at NARN, who has just year after year been one of my favorite grassroots groups, especially when it comes to advocating for animals in labs. So it's really awesome. I know there's folks who've been involved in these campaigns for a long time here with us today, and really grateful for all the awesome activism that you all are doing. And I know there's a variety of people and experiences here today when we're talking about issues with animals in labs. And so hopefully some of this will be new to you. And if you're just new to this issue, I hope this will be a good introduction as well into the ways that animals are suffering inside laboratories, and also how it's a failed science. And, you know, hopefully this can be motivation to keep working to fight for them and to fight to close down these laboratories. So as Rachel said, I work for Rise for Animals. I'm the director of Grassroots Organizing. We are mostly a Boston-based group, but I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. But we really do a lot of work with laboratories, targeting laboratories with grassroots groups around the country. And so today we're going to focus first on the tragedy of experiments on animals. And in my mind, there's two pieces of this. It's the way that animals are suffering inside these labs, but also the ways that laws are failing to protect animals in labs. Then I'll discuss a bit about the failure of experiments, essentially how non-human animals have not and continue to not be effective models of human diseases. And then lastly, we'll discuss a little bit about what we can do to help. And our theory of change really is all about shifting minds, priorities, and policies, and ending animal experimentation within our lifetime. And so I'll kind of just go through a lot of this directly for a while and be talking at you, but I promise there will be time for question and answer afterwards. And I know Rachel has been kind and generous enough to be able to answer some specific questions about the University of Washington and what's happening there to animals in labs, as she has been following what's happening locally for a number of years and has been going to the IACUC meetings there for a long time. She has a really good sense of what kinds of experiments are happening to animals there locally. And for any folks who are joining who aren't in Washington, if there's folks from there, if you're looking for information about laboratories in your community, I'll be happy to throw in my email in the chat later. I would love to help you find out what's happening to animals in labs and how you can help them. So let's, want to make sure I respect folks' time. Okay, let's first discuss some of the tragedies of experimenting on animals. And to begin with, I want to start with talking about laws that are supposed to protect animals in labs. Because a common question I get, and maybe you all get in your outreach and in your efforts to talk about this issue, is that, well, there's laws protecting these animals and the researchers are clearly looking out for the animals. It's in their own best interest, right? This is a really common misconception, but the reality is that there's only one federal law really intended to protect animals in labs, and it's a complete failure. So the one federal law that is supposedly there to help animals in labs and to protect them is the Animal Welfare Act. And this, or it's called the AWA for short. So it was enacted in 1966, and it is the only federal law that provides even minimal protection for animals in labs. And unfortunately, the Animal Welfare Act doesn't even touch the actual experiments happening, really. It doesn't prohibit any kind of experiment on animals, no matter how much pain or suffering it might be causing. Instead, what it does is it relies on what are called IACUCs, or Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees. And they rely on these IACUCs to review different protocols, different proposals to use animals. And if the IACUC says, like, oh, this research we deem it to be important enough and we approve what they're going to do to the animals, then that's totally fine by the Animal Welfare Act. Really, what the Animal Welfare Act governs is things like the standards for the housing of the animals and their feeding and handling and veterinary care. So really, by and large, what the Animal Welfare Act is doing for animals in labs is the time outside of the experiment, the time where they are in cages waiting to be experimented on, their daily life. And we're going to take a look at what that means, and you can decide for yourself if this seems sufficient protection for them. But before we go into that and I show you kind of what this ends up meaning, it's also really important to note that the Animal Welfare Act, year after year, has been chipped away at to become even less meaningful for animals in labs. And one of the worst ways in my mind that this has happened was called the Helms Amendment. And what the Helms Amendment did was it redefined what an animal is by the Animal Welfare Act. And it redefined an animal so that it specifically excludes the most commonly used animals in labs. It now excludes, so it doesn't provide any protection to rats, mice, birds, cold-blooded animals like fish, which are more and more used in laboratories, cephalopods, and certain farmed animals. So all of these species of animals have no protection under the Animal Welfare Act, which means they have no federal protection for how they're used in laboratories and the kind of care that they're getting. So part of the problem of this, part of the problem that these animals are not, getting any sort of oversight from the Animal Welfare Act is that we literally don't even know how many of these animals are in labs. Labs do not even have to count how many mice and rats and birds and fish that they are experimenting on every year. So it's impossible to know precisely or even really have really good guesses as to how many animals are suffering and dying inside labs every year. And I just think it's just so egregious that we can't even give them the very basic dignity of being counted as a being, but what we do know of the animals who do get to have those basic protections under the Animal Welfare Act, one of the things that laboratories have to do is report to the USDA how many of those animals they did use in research that year. So this is numbers that we compiled from the most recent data that is up right now, which is 2019 in the United States. And you'll see there were about 1 million animals in labs or experimented on in labs in 2019 of these protected species. So these are cats, sheep, dogs, pigs, hamsters, non-human primates, rabbits, guinea pigs, and then this broad other animals, which a lot of animals fit under that. Ferrets, some other genuses of rats and mice, certain other types of farm animals like goats, a lot of labs just fill out the form wrong. So this is actually a really conservative estimate of these numbers of animals in labs. When the USDA inspector has looked at annual report data from the labs, they've consistently found that many of them underreport how many animals they actually used. So this is all a very conservative amount of animals being used in experiments in the US. And since most folks are up in the Seattle area, I just wanted to highlight one of the labs there from the report they submitted to the USDA in 2019. These are the common species used, again, the species protected under the Animal Welfare Act. And so you'll see nearly half of the animals protected by the AWA at the University of Washington are non-human primates. And for those maybe who aren't in the area or people brand new to learning about this issue, University of Washington does have one of the flagship primate research centers in the country, one of just a few. So there's a lot of different species of non-human primates suffering at the University of Washington. Also a surprising number of pigs, rabbits, and dogs being used in experiments at the University of Washington. Now I mentioned the standards of care that the Animal Welfare Act allows. And I just like to share these photos. I'm sorry, I should have warned that this was coming up. I don't think I'll share any other photos that are more graphic than this. But this is all spaces that are allowed under the Animal Welfare Act. None of this is a violation by the Animal Welfare Act. So you'll see, this rabbit undergoing this painful skin experiment in this stainless steel box that is approved housing for rabbits by the Animal Welfare Act. Same with the beagle in the lower corner there, with the primate who has screws drilled into his head to implant a metal halo device and a permanent collar around his neck that they use to try to take him in and out of the cage every time as safely as they can, since they are still wild animals, of course. And then Robert the cat here, this was from an investigation at the University of Utah in 2009. Robert the cat had an electrode implanted in his brain. And again, that is all fine by the Animal Welfare Act. None of this is showing anything illegal. And the center photo is just the type of images you'll see. This is rats and mice, how they're kept in laboratories a lot of times. It's floor to ceiling, similar to, when you look at factory farms of chickens and it's just animals stacked and stacked. That's how laboratories look for a lot of them, for the smaller species like rats and mice, and they're just stacked, and a lot of things are automated, just like we see in factory farms. They have water automated to them. Everything is very mechanized in a lot of ways. And so it's, this is all completely legal under the Animal Welfare Act. Now, as I mentioned, it's hard to know exactly how many animals are in labs because they don't even have the dignity of being counted if you're a rat or a mouse or a cold-blooded animal, but it's estimated that only 1% of animals in labs are protected by the Animal Welfare Act. And there was just a study put out just in the last couple weeks in Nature magazine that is now estimating the total number of animals used in experiments in the United States each year is more like 110 million animals when you factor in all of those species who are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And in addition to this, it costs a lot of taxpayer dollar money to be funding these laboratories. The National Institutes of Health alone are spending about $18 billion a year on animal experiments. And this is all taxpayer money. And that's the main institution that's using taxpayer money to fund animal research, but it's not the only one. So this is a huge business in this country. Now, there is one other policy that is intended, again, that is supposedly to help animals in labs. This is called the PHS Policy on Humane Care and Use of Lab Animals. But this, again, like the name suggests, this is a policy. It is not a law. And so there's really no meaningful repercussions with this policy. But if a laboratory is doing experiments that are getting that money, that taxpayer money from the National Institutes of Health, they are required to abide by the PHS policy, which does very simple things like require some record keeping, and it might include a facility inspection. And they again require the IACUCs to review the experimental protocols and that sort of thing. And laboratories are also required to report to the agency that oversees the PHS policy anytime they essentially make a mistake in the lab, which can be a really insightful way to learn about ways that animals are suffering in laboratories. And one positive thing about the PHS policy is it does actually include rats and mice. And so you can get a little bit more of a glimpse inside what's happening to rats and mice by looking at information from the agency that oversees the PHS policy, which is called OLA. But again, this is guidance, it's not law, and it really lacks meaningful repercussions anytime that the policy is violated. So I like to just point out an example to illustrate this. I read a lot of documents about laboratories that violate the PHS policy because they have to report that to OLA, and then we read those documents. And time after time, I can tell you, like, OLA responds with the same copy and paste answer of, we think you did the right thing, there's no cause for further action. It's essentially, it's like a copy and paste thing on every single time these laboratories are violating the policy. So what kinds of repercussions do they face? One story I remember distinctly because it was one of the ones that I thought was the worst, and maybe the repercussions would finally happen. This was at Louisiana State University, and an experimenter at LSU was supposed to be doing a bone graft surgery on one of the hind legs of each of 10 mice. That was what the surgery he was supposed to do that day. But he got to work late, and he didn't start until the afternoon. And that led to like this whole stream of bad problems happening because he came to work late. So because he was rushing through these surgeries, he didn't really read what he was supposed to do. And instead of doing the surgery on one hind leg of these mice, he ended up doing it on both hind legs of the mice, which is not only twice the trauma to the mouse, but it also made it so that they were completely immobilized and unable to reach food and water because both of their hind legs had been had this surgery on. And to make matters worse, he didn't even give the mice the pain medication that he was required to give them. He just skipped it entirely. And the veterinarian who later reviewed what happened to these mice said that the mice were completely crippled and some couldn't even bend their legs at all. And again, to make matters even worse, when it got to be late, the lights in the laboratory automatically shut off. That's how a lot of labs are. It's the same lights on and off every single day. And instead of stopping for the day, he decided to finish the surgeries using just the flashlight on his cell phone. If you can imagine being a patient and having that be your reality for surgery. I mean, it obviously led to even more problems. And the next day when the veterinarian on staff came, they saw that a lot of the mice sutures had burst open and were getting infected from the bedding in the cages. Some of them had already died, and they just decided to euthanize the rest, which is a friendly word, especially for the way that they kill mice in labs, since it's usually a gas chamber. But you would think with all these problems, okay, clearly they must have done something with this person, right? But what LSU decided to do was let the experimenters stay, but have to go through a couple trainings and a bit more supervision. And the agency that oversees the PHS policy said, that sounds right to us. So this is like just to illustrate, this is time and again what we see, a total failure of repercussions, even when labs do really egregious forms of animal abuse that should supposedly have some sort of protection. On a brighter note, there are some helpful laws and policies out there. The first one, the Freedom of Information Act, I like to include this, but especially for activists in the room. This is a great tool to learn what's happening inside laboratories in your community. And there's also state open records laws. Washington actually has a pretty good open records laws. So if you're interested in public universities or other public facilities experimenting on animals in Washington, it's a tool you can use to learn more about what's happening. There's also been several statewide post-research adoption laws. The most recent I've seen, that 12 had passed, and there's still 6 pending. And these only started happening in 2015 through a lot of the good work of Beagle Freedom Projects. So these are just laws that say, when you're done experimenting on animals, you have to at least give them a chance at a normal life, and especially, like, particularly dogs and cats. Another helpful law is that Virginia has effectively banned Category E experiments on dogs and cats. Category E is experiments that are deemed to be painful and not given any pain medication, no pain relief for those animals. So it's the worst of the experiments happening. And then there's some really great dissection choice policies at universities across the country as well. I want to discuss a little bit about the ways animals are suffering in labs, but I do encourage you if you can stomach it, to Google and look at actual footage of investigations of animals in labs to really get a good look at that. I'm not going to share any of that footage today, but there's a lot of footage that you can really see the ways that animals are suffering in laboratories. And a common question people ask me is, like, what animals are even used for in laboratories? And people tend to jump right to things like cosmetic testing, which is actually very minimal in the United States now, which is a great thing, and really only came because of people pressure and people collectively telling these companies to knock it off, right? But a lot of the animals used in experiments in the United States is actually just for basic research. So this is using animals as models to try to understand the basic biology or mechanisms of a disease. That's different from applied research, which is using animals as models for drug or product toxicity, or how effective they are. There's also some other smaller ways that animals are used in experiments. Their bodies are used as factories for monoclonal antibodies. I've also seen their bodies used to keep ticks alive for different kinds of experiments about diseases that pass through ticks. But they keep the animals in the lab so that the tick stays alive. It's really depressing. A lot of the experiments happening to animals in labs are really because of general scientific curiosity and the drive for careers and science careers to get published. I really think that's what a lot of it boils down to, especially in the university setting. But there is also still some live animal labs as well, and some veterinary training. Some of that can be done ethically through client animals and good partnerships with rescues for things like spay and neuter practice, but some of it has its own ethical issues as well. And when we think about the ways animals are suffering inside labs, and sometimes it can be hard to know exactly what kind of experiment is happening in labs in your community, but there is a few things that we know about animals inside labs across the country every day, and that's the ways they're generally suffering from just the environment that they're in. Even if you take out the actual experiment, the conditions they live inside laboratories is just appalling. And I show this whole image because this is another one of the bad decisions that where the Animal Welfare Act got watered down and chipped away at. They made an exception to the exercise requirement for dogs if you keep the dog in a cage that's twice the size that they legally require through the Animal Welfare Act. This is a photo of a dog in that size of cage. So dogs that are kept in this size cage is technically twice as big as they are required to be. And since that is twice as big, it says, the AWA says now that that is sufficient space for that dog to get exercise in that own space, and they never have to be taken out. They only touch that stainless steel cage. They're only taken out to be used in the experiments, never to touch grass, never to chase a ball, never to play with other dogs. That's not every lab operates like this, but a majority of them do, especially the private laboratories. This is a photo to illustrate that as well. This is my rescue beagle Ellie, and this was a photo that I took in my kitchen just to show how much space when she was in a lab she had, which is hard to imagine, you know, after getting to know her and seeing how, just like all dogs, she really values being able to explore and being able to sniff other places and get exercise. I just like to share pictures of Ellie. She actually passed away last summer, but she was a really special dog for us. And she was born at Marshall Bioresources. They breed animals for the animal experimentation industry, and then was shipped to a lab in California. And she didn't get out of that lab until she was 8 years old. And that's when she came to live with us through the awesome work of Beagle Freedom Project. And I can tell you, I can see the ways that she suffered inside the lab because it had lasting effects on her body. When we first got her, her muscles had atrophied so much because she never had exercise that she could only make it about the distance of 1 to 2 houses on walks before she would sit down, and we would have to put her in her wagon to bring her the rest of the way or turn back home. She of course was never potty trained, and as soon as she needed to go, she went. That's how life in a cage is when you never get out of the cage. Grass was very foreign to her. The first time we took her to a dog park, she just walked the perimeter fence and just balanced on the cement. That's the only kind of texture she was used to being able to walk on. So seeing these survivors and what happens to them, you can really tell the ways that, just without even knowing the experiments that happened to her, the living conditions of laboratories alone, we know cause immense suffering for all animals. When we're thinking of what kinds of experiments are happening to animals and how are they suffering through these experimental procedures, it's really just limitless. I've never been, it's like nothing fails to shock me anymore. I just saw recently an experiment that was literally trying to learn why humans tend to like reality TV more, and trying to force monkeys to watch like their equivalent of reality TV versus more nature type documentary and edited and less like reality TV. It's just like there's literally no absurd thing that has not happened in a laboratory, but some of the common things that I see, this is taken from an excerpt from Arizona State University, and this experimenter got permission from his Iacuk to violate the Animal Welfare Act, like he was not giving the monkeys food and water during the day, which is a requirement from the AWA, but because this is part of his experiment, he didn't have to do that. He could violate that requirement of the Animal Welfare Act. And the reason why he wasn't giving this monkey food or water during the day was that when he put this monkey in a restraint chair, like you can see in this image, the monkey would be encouraged to follow through and obey orders, because if he did, he would get the slightest, just a drop of water. And if you are that thirsty, if you have not had access to water all day, if you're a monkey, you will really essentially obey your master in that moment just for that drop of water. And not only that, but this one was a really horrible experiment because they're in this kind of restraint for up to 6 hours every day, 7 days a week as part of this experiment. So they're completely restrained, their head can't move. They were experimenting using different types of jackets like you see here, to be able to track their arm movement. And this image was actually taken before the actual experiment started. When the actual experiment starts, the monkey looks more similar to Frick, the monkey on the right, because they have these screws drilled into the sides of their skull so that they can implant this metal halo device to be able to keep their head completely immobilized. These are common tools. This kind of primate restraint chair is used all the time at the University of Washington. These kinds of really extreme procedures are quite common inside laboratories. And I want to re-emphasize, since the Animal Welfare Act isn't governing over the experiment themselves, there is truly no such thing as an illegal experiment on animals in the United States. This is actually the code of the Animal Welfare Act that verbalizes that. The Animal Welfare Act is really not supposed to be governing or creating guidelines for the actual experimentation itself. So let's transition a bit and talk about, there's all this suffering, laws are failing to protect animals in labs, but a lot of people think, okay, but maybe it's still worth it because it's either them or us, and I want us to win. That's, sometimes this is the language I hear from people, is like recognizing this is clear animal suffering, and yeah, they're not really protected, but is like, it must be worth it. Why else would we be doing it, right? And time and again, we see that using animals as models continues to fail for humans, in addition to the ways it obviously is a complete failure for the animals themselves. And this is just a great quote by a wonderful philosopher, I think, that really explains the problem essentially of what's happening to animals in labs. They say that they're experimenting on animals because the animals are like us, but when you say, why is it morally okay that we experiment on animals? Experimenters say because the animals are not like us. It has to be one or the other, right? And what we find, and it's actually not even me, it's not Rise for Animals finding these statistics. This statistic itself comes from the National Institutes of Health, who fund all this animal research, and other agencies like them, like the FDA, has found very similar numbers. All above 90% of the drugs that are appearing safe and effective in animal models fail when they get to human clinical trials. It's a complete failure. And the kinds of reviews to get to this statistic are called systematic reviews, and that's when researchers are looking at the totality of information about a particular question and then provide an exhaustive summary of the information. This is really like the strongest evidence that we have in science, these systematic reviews. And all the systematic reviews support moving away from using animals as models for human disease. And I don't want to just rely on statistics. I think it's important to look at just a few cases of failure. It's literally dozens and dozens that you can look at in published papers. But a few that have stuck out to me is the polio vaccine. was actually long delayed because they started doing experiments on monkeys. Monkeys contract polio through the nose. And so they were trying to figure out, learning about this disease and coming up with a vaccine, assuming that we are getting polio through the nose, but we actually contracted it through the mouth. Years, this ended up having long delays to getting the vaccine that was really critically needed. And similar, like penicillin was the first effective antibiotic, and it actually had been developed but shelved for more than a decade because it was experimented on in rabbits, and there was no positive effect on the rabbits. Rabbits essentially just, it just passed through their bodies and didn't have an effect on them. So, we could have had penicillin a decade earlier had we have not been relying on this kind of animal data. And then another example of failure that I think most people have seen now, or have been connected to in some way, is the failure of linking smoking and lung cancer. And actually for years, there was epidemiological data, studying human populations, showing a clear link between smoking tobacco and showing that that can lead to lung cancer. The epidemiological studies of humans and human populations was showing that, but regulatory authorities kept denying it, certainly with the help of big tobacco funding their own experiments, but they were pointing to animal models and looking at animal models and how they weren't getting lung cancer when they were forced to inhale tobacco smoke every day, excessive amounts of tobacco smoke. But that's because lung cancer is really difficult to reproduce in these animals. So these are just a few cases. Again, you can look through all sorts of published papers to find more examples of how we're failing by focusing on the animal models. This is just another example of that. A lot of the basic research happening, so not even looking at the solutions for things, but the kinds of trying to learn about stroke using animal models. Experimenters will basically just try to induce a stroke in animals, which obviously is not how humans have strokes. That is years of your life that happen before and that lead to that stroke. That's not how they study strokes in animals. And regardless, they've had more than 700 effective treatments for stroke in animal experiments. And of those, they've moved about 150 to the human clinical trials, and yet none of those have been proven effective in humans. So 700 plus effective in animal models, none of them effective for humans. HIV vaccines, very similar. We're getting close to 100 successful HIV vaccines in animal experiments, and yet none have proven effective in humans. As a matter of fact, some have even increased the risk of HIV. So the animal model is failing, not only for drugs, but also for understanding vaccines. And it's not just in these systematic reviews and in published papers where we're starting to see people really come to grips with this and start to be honest about the ways that animal models are failing. We're starting to find that a lot of the people involved in animal experiments themselves are starting to speak out against this. This is a quote from the former director of the National Cancer Institute, admitting we've been curing cancer in mice for decades, dozens and dozens of times. It just doesn't translate to humans. So what can we do? What's the alternative, right? How can we still, be benefiting humans, be moving towards effective ways to resolve these diseases that we all have connection to? We all want things like cancer to be solved, right? It's not that people who care about animals don't care about people with cancer. These are all critically important and need to be resolved. But we need to be focusing on the alternatives that have come around and that are a lot more promising and are a lot better use of our time and energy and don't have the same kind of suffering that the animal models do. This is a list of just some of the alternatives. Some of them, like the organ on a chip technology, has come up so fast and has really been developing so well that there've been studies looking at organ on a chip technology versus animal models to see which one is better able to predict how drugs will respond in humans during the clinical trials. And they're finding already the organ on a chip technology is predicting that better than the animal models. We need to just start transitioning to them. We need to get out of our old antiquated laws and regulations that are still requiring these animal models as part of drug and vaccine development, as well as the basic research. Because there's certainly a lot of laws and regulations in the way for stopping animal experiments, like the laws and regulations required for vaccine and pharmaceutical development and medical technologies. But a lot of the experiments happening on animals have nothing to do with that. A lot of the animal experiments happening in the US are the basic research as well. And so it's important to think through, like, how can we move away from that? And I think Dr. Raza here hit the nail on the head as to why we kind of don't see that transition. And it kind of boils down to inertia. This is what these experimenters have always been doing. This, they've built their career on it. It becomes very hard after 30 years of trying to study, cancer or stroke, whatever, in animal models, to admit to yourself and to others that this is going nowhere. And these are the same people who end up being the ones who review grants and decide where money goes. So it's just bad inertia happening at the moment. And that's why more pressure is needed to force these institutions to change their antiquated ways. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about how we at Rise for Animals are working to solve this issue, but I don't want to focus too long on this. I want to open up conversation about University of Washington and the good work that NARN does there in Washington. But some of the ways that we are working to resolve this issue is we have a policy team who is focusing on advocating for these animals and pushing through policy efforts on both the state and federal level. One of our great policy team members, Frances, actually she went to law school so that she could help animals. She studied animal law, and what she found is that things like the Animal Welfare Act are so weak and lack such meaningful repercussions. She didn't even want to be an attorney to represent those animals without first getting those laws changed so that there are meaningful repercussions that then she can be suing these labs for. So this is what she does. And she's, in the last Congress, was really focused on the Humane Retirement Act. And as you all know, we have a new Congress, and so a lot more stuff is coming out that she's working on in the meantime. But if you're interested in lobbying work or want to learn more, her contact information is here. Another way that we expose what's happening to animals in labs is we publicize every record that we have of animal experiments in laboratories. So we have a team who is constantly submitting records requests and FOIA requests to labs and the agencies that fund them around the country. And we're putting it all online so that we have less of an information gap with this issue. So this is especially helpful if you're an activist trying to learn what's happening in labs in your communities. You can search by where you are, or you can search by a specific institution. Really helpful to learn what's happening inside labs. And this is called Arlo. If you go to arlo.riseforanimals.org, you can poke around there and see all the information that we have on laboratories in your community. Let's see, I think I have time. I'm just going to show this 1-minute clip to show another way that we're exposing this problem and to talk a little bit about a nationwide campaign that we're just getting off the ground at Rise. So I'm going to share this 1-minute video with you all and then breeze through the rest of this. So hopefully you'll be able to hear.
It's one of the largest dog breeders for the animal experimentation industry in the United States. 23,000 dogs held captive. Also cats, mini pigs, guinea pigs, mice, and ferrets. This is Marshall Bioresources. breeding animals for torture in laboratory experiments around the world, private companies that force animals to ingest chemicals like pesticides to test toxicity, universities that sever dogs' spinal nerves, cut off their tails, and implant electrodes on their bladders. It's part of an $18 billion industry that works hard to hide its abuse from you, erasing any trace of these animals because if you know, you will care.
All right, so I just wanted to share that all with you folks because this is a nationwide campaign that RISE has against Marshall Bioresources. We are pressuring their company because if we stop the pipeline of dogs to labs, we can significantly reduce how many dogs are being used in experiments, and eventually that's how we're going to end these experiments from happening. And Marshall Bioresources is a particularly it's able to be a nationwide campaign because not only do they sell to labs across the country, but they also have a side company called Marshall Pet Products. And Marshall Pet Products are sold in places like Petco around the country. So I'll just leave it at that. But if folks are interested in being part of this campaign, certainly contact me. We'd love to have your support with it. Other ways that we are fighting are through doing a lot of skill building with folks, offering free workshops, leadership development and organizing skills, offering campaign planning support for folks across the country, and helping to fund grassroots campaigns as much as we can across the country as well. So I know most folks are tuning in from Washington, but if you're other places, I just want to point out how many labs there are in this country. And if you're interested in starting a campaign in your community, if you live in a city, there is a laboratory near you. And so certainly reach out. I'd love to help you get that off the ground. But hopefully all you Seattle folks are getting involved with NARN and the good work they do to pressure University of Washington. So I'll leave it at that. I will leave this up for just a second before I stop sharing my screen for anyone who has follow-up questions or wants sources for any of the information I shared, or just has questions about other things related to laboratories in your community. My email is always open. I would love to connect with you all. So yeah, so thanks for that. I'm going to stop sharing and then actually, I think Rachel, maybe she's just coming back in, but I'll maybe hand it over to Rachel to discuss a little bit about University of Washington, or defer if you prefer to switch to Q&A and you can help with the University of Washington stuff, Rachel.
Yeah, hi, thanks Amy for that. That was, I mean, it's always depressing for those sort of things, but it's very informative, and I think it's really necessary for us to know what we're dealing with when we're talking about animal experimentation. Oh yeah, so I don't know if you see in the chat, but Terry asked if you could share the slide deck. I mean, I can in the chat, or we can actually mail it to folks if you don't mind sending us. Oh, I think you did send me the slideshow, so I have it somewhere, unless you've updated it.
I probably did update it, but yeah, I'll just send you a PDF version, Rachel, and then you can email it out to folks who are here today.
And I'm just going to put in the chat the link to the that Arlo thing you mentioned.
Oh yeah.
Because it is really helpful. There's, it's difficult to find data on a lot of these labs. So it's really helpful what RISE has done.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've had, when we were trying to discuss with grassroots activists, like what the burdens are to starting campaigns against labs in their community. And it's the information barrier, not knowing what's happening inside these labs, which is obviously intentional. They fight very hard for you to not know what's happening to animals in these labs. And certainly we don't know everything. We try to use the laws that exist to learn what we can, but there's a lot of secrecy that happens inside these labs. And, we can't find out everything, but we can, anything we can find out, we think the public should know too. The public deserves to know as much as they can. This is especially because it's funded by their money. They deserve to know everything that's happening to these animals.
Yeah. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the stuff at the UW. I'd rather kind of answer people's more specific questions. I'm also just going to slap a link to Rise for Animals in there. But like Amy mentioned, a lot of the stuff that goes on at the University of Washington is just basic research where they're doing things, memory experiments on on monkeys. And so they will use restraint devices to put electrodes in their head to, see how long that they can remember to do particular movements. They have a study that's been going on since the 70s to track eye movement. So again, a restraint device is used. And what was interesting to me is this researcher, his last name is Fetz. He recently got some kind of award for basically a failed experiment because he's been doing this for since the 1970s, and he's been putting restraint, exactly what Amy described with those collars and the device stuck into their head and coils in their eyes. I mean, it's really, really awful. And yet he got some sort of recognition. I just noticed this the other day for doing this. It's just horrible. And it's this ongoing cycle of people publishing papers and doing things because they wonder what will happen when they smash a ferret's head in and see if they can do a maze the same way. I mean, there's really no benefit to human health. There's another study where they are trying to change a mouse's feeding patterns. So they'll actually they'll shock their feet at night. You can't think of any way this would possibly translate to help human beings. And as Amy mentioned, 95% of the time, these things fail when you get to human studies. Years ago, I worked actually for a committee that reviews human studies. It's called an institutional review board. And some of the papers I would read where they would talk about the animal experiments, if it wasn't favorable to what they were trying to do, the outcome of the animal experiments wasn't favorable to what the outcome they were hoping would appear with humans, they would explain it away like, well, we don't really think this is applicable because X, Y, and Z. And if it was favorable to what they were trying to replicate in humans, then that was good. That was fine. But they would just use whatever language they want to either accept the animal experiment data or dismiss it. So it's even in those kind of things where they're trying to get a potentially beneficial drug to market, the animal data is really just there so that they can get their drug into clinical trials and be tested on humans. So it just does not good for people, and it's a waste of money too. We spent all of this money caring for the animals in the labs. The University of Washington spends a lot of money caring for the animals in lab, and to get very little results. So it's a huge sink of taxpayer dollars because that's who's paying for it. It's us. We pay for this. Not, usually it's not private institutions. It's coming from the NIH. So does anyone have any particular questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question. In light of COVID, the COVID vaccine, I've heard that animal studies were bypassed in order to get the vaccine. If that is true, what are the repercussions of this, do you think?
I think Lisa, who's also on the call, might know a little more than me, but from what I understand, they did bypass a bunch, but they didn't like give the monkeys COVID purposely. Anyway, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some bunch of monkeys in labs that have caught COVID incidentally, but I think that they did use some monkeys to test to see whether it would be harmful to them, the vaccine itself. I know of at least one lab that did that, but I don't know overall. I'm pretty sure that they skipped over a lot of the stuff that is usually done because they were in such a hurry.
Right.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that it essentially, they were allowed to run concurrently. So they were still doing the animal experiments, but we're also proceeding to the human clinical trials at the same time. This has happened with like a few other times as well, like when we desperately needed treatment or vaccine to try to speed up the process, and kind of invalidating the need for the animals in the first place in my mind, like because they just, it's like recognizing that, okay, we don't actually need to prove it in the monkeys, but they still went through it to be legally compliant. And another thing I've certainly noticed too is that like anytime there's these kinds of huge news items related to diseases, there's just this complete clamoring from laboratories to try to use it, to try to get grant funding. So even after the vaccines were being developed, I was still seeing all these primate labs crying about not having enough monkeys to experiment on to find a vaccine and to find a, and it's like we have 3 vaccines that have already passed through human clinical trials, and yet these primate labs are still saying, oh, we need more primates, we need to get this COVID vaccine. So, I mean, it's certainly, I'm not an expert in by any means in that stuff, but it's just like an observation I was making.
And it was a good observation. Something that came out really early on this was that a group in the UK actually went and they found that when they took the SARS-CoV-2 and they put it in the monkey. Actually, no, first they put it in the tissue culture cell, which was actually monkey cells. And then because they wanted to reproduce as much virus as possible, they then took that virus out, they sequenced it, and they found out, so they had the original human COVID virus that was in there, but they also had a monkey adapted virus at that point as well. And this was kind of, it didn't get as much play as it should, but this was a really big deal because it's something that's been going on all along, but for the first time, because there were so many people focusing on this type of research and able to do this type of sequencing, we could finally say, folks, that's why it just doesn't work in these animal models, because these viruses actually adapt and mutate and change directly in the animals. So that was a big deal.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the UW is that they have actually a bunch of alternatives. Like they've developed several different kinds of organs on a chip, but they don't really think about using that technology that they have developed to replace some of the animal experimentation that they're doing, which is really unfortunate.
Rachel, I have a question related to that. With the, I understand the part about institutional inertia and how, when you've been doing something for so long, it's hard to break out of that mold or that rut. But with the growing evidence that the organ on a chip and other testing methods are effective and reliable, what is the rate of uptake, in reputable labs? I mean, are at least some of them starting to make this switch?
I really don't think so. I mean, I can really, in terms of institutions like universities, I can really only speak to the University of Washington, and they're uniquely obstinate about moving away from using animals. I mean, they started using pigs again to train surgeons, even though that they had a couple years of surgeons not being able to being trained on surgical techniques and not using pigs. They've used ferrets for intubation techniques when they have, other non-animal models like Trauma Man and a couple other things. So they really didn't need to use the ferrets. They didn't need to use the pigs, but they did it anyway. But for things like pharmaceutical companies, when they're trying to test, when they contract out, because they never do this testing themselves, they always contract it out, to test a substance or a drug or some kind of treatment, they could use the organ on a chip, but they're so used to doing the animal experimentation. It's just like, well, we need to study this substance, so we're going to send it off to this lab that does the testing. And that's kind of it. Like that's it for them. They don't really think about using something else, because it is this, I'm just going to do what I was taught to do. I'm going to do what I know has worked before, or, it doesn't work actually. And then there's the issue of if they want to get their drug or their treatment through the FDA to be used in human clinical trials, is the FDA expects a certain amount of data. It's not in writing, it's not like law, but you basically can't get your drug through unless it's been tested on a couple different rodents, a larger animal, and then a primate. And so if you give them data like, well, I've studied this on an organ on a chip, then the FDA is going to say, well, we want more. So there are some groups like PCRM that are working to change that. So the FDA will accept data from organ on a chip, but for right now, they'll just kick it back. And the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to fight it because they just want they could push back and say, no, we think our data is sufficient and we think our treatment is safe to be used in humans. But they're not going to because they just want their stuff on the market.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question for you, Amy. So one of the things that we're focusing on here with UW is that the precedent that Harvard set with their New England Primate Center. And yet no one really knows what it was that finally brought that one down. Do you have any insight?
That's a good question. And I love, Lisa, that you're thinking in those terms too, and trying to look at, okay, like this has happened, what worked, what was the right formula? And I've looked at that too, because it was like pretty unique, obviously, for our movement so far. And the only thing, I don't think that there was like one thing that worked, but it seemed like they had this like constant stream of embarrassment for a while, and obviously PETA did a lot of stuff to do that. SANE also, I think a lot of like getting them bad publicity all the time, that Budke was doing with SANE and just exposing all their violations. I think that really started to have a huge impact as well. Like sometimes those things isolated maybe don't make a big difference, but when it's like your reputation is just really going in the trash, especially when you're an institution like Harvard who cares about their reputation more than just about anything, I think that can make a huge difference. But I don't really know. And it's, it's unfortunate because you never really hear the honest answer of why they're shutting down. So it's hard to say, but I have to think that like universities especially, they're afraid of losing money, but they're also really afraid of the reputational harm. And I think that's kind of, if we can tap into that and ruining their reputation as an institution and getting in front of their donors and things like that, especially now, like universities, especially during the pandemic and stuff, I think they are more just fearful of losing some of that, even like donor dollars. But I don't know, it's hard, especially places with huge research facilities, they get so much money from the grants themselves. I think it's hard for them to cut away from that because they just see the dollars. So I don't know, it's a hard one, but.
I think the point that you're making about transparency or visibility, not necessarily transparency, because UW certainly has not been transparent, but just getting that message out there that, there are on campus 500 or 600 monkeys, downtown we've got a few hundred monkeys, and down in Arizona 500 more, and certainly I think that the vast majority of UW staff and faculty and the public simply are not aware of that. So it's getting those eyes on that, but beyond that, it's a tough sell because it is so embedded within the public consciousness or psyche, the belief that you can't have these successful vaccines, these successful treatments without animals. And yet, you did a really nice job of going through there and presenting the data, which says it doesn't work. There is no HIV vaccine. There are no malaria vaccines. There are no TB vaccines. There's no Alzheimer's vaccines. And a lot of that, the direct line can be drawn back to this, whether it's the route of transmission that we're using for these viruses or these pathogens, or it's the animals confounded simply by keeping them in these cages and screwing up their microbiome, or, destroying their emotional well-being, which is affecting everything else about them. But those are not, you gave this talk in a very concise way to an audience that was very receptive to it. but it took you 30 minutes to kind of work people through that. And it's like, we all know, you know, at best we've got 30 seconds.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And I do think that there's a lot of potential there if like we can just get the public to start seeing the reality of it. You know, I remember reading, I can't remember where it was from. I think it was a Canadian published paper a few years back, but it talked about, it was looking at people from different backgrounds a lot in like higher education though, and it was like assessing, doing surveys of if they thought it was, you know, morally acceptable to experiment on animals. And it is like the public is on our side more on this issue than sometimes I like forget how many people are on our side already. It's like better than most other animal issues, except maybe fur. But even the people who say like, yes, it's morally acceptable to experiment on animals, then they ask like, okay, but what if most of the time, you know, like by and large, like more than 90% of the time, that animal data isn't actually translating to humans? Then the number of people who said it's not morally acceptable skyrockets to like in the 80%, you know, 80, 90%. And that is the reality. And so it's just a matter of, you know, fighting against this enormous institution that is a billions and billions of dollars machine that tries hard to keep this hidden. It's, you know, how can we break through that so people see that reality? Because I think they would be, you know, like that study showed, people would be against it. Those remaining people who are skeptical of what we're saying, once that really breaks through, I think they join us on our side of seeing it's not ethical.
Yeah. And then, you know, changing laws too is part of the important component, because the universities are going to be sticklers because they're so used to just doing this kind of curiosity driven research. But if you change the laws to allow the pharmaceutical companies to use organ on chip and other data, they're like, fine, we don't need experimental animals. It's cool. We'll do this other thing. Because they don't particularly care about that aspect of it. It's you know, to the business.
Yeah, they want what is cheap and what will protect them legally from repercussions in the future, essentially.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of companies, and cosmetics included, that's like, you know, yeah, we don't want to have to do this if there's another cheap way that we can still protect ourselves. Like, that's what it comes down to for a lot of those companies.
Yeah. It's from, you know, talking to other folks too that have been involved in institutions. There's just the people that are appalled by animal research tend to get weeded out, because why would they want to participate in that? So you end up with this cycle of people that everybody disagrees with each other, and you don't have these dissenting opinions because the dissenting opinions get pushed out.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting to see people who have been, you know, in these labs and who have worked in these labs, and researchers who have had a change of heart, like the way they get completely shut out of that community. That's a real thing, obviously, you know, as you know, and that's a really terrifying thing, I think, for people to do, especially if that's been your community, to all of a sudden have like to lose all those friendships and things because you've had a change, you know, you think differently now. That's like a hard thing to expect people to do. So I think that's like another confounding, just like the social and like our own like emotional dilemmas of why this continues, because it's hard to speak out, and researchers and people in labs who have really get shut out of those friendships in that community.
Lisa knows that very well. She came from the University of Washington.
You know, it's interesting what you just said with that. So again, having spent 30 years and with a significant research portfolio and background, you know, a colleague of mine, when I told him that I was actually going to PETA as their scientific advisor, you know, he shrieked. He's like, PETA? Are you kidding me? Because it's, you know, the animal activist community, animal rights community is not looked upon fondly. But I've you know, over the last 6 or 18 months, you know, he's even said to me, you know, actually, you make me uncomfortable. And I was like, He's like, you know, if someone like you, who I know understands the science, can come forward and say that, you know, there are real issues here, and who can actually take part of this animal rights community, it actually then puts my former troop, speaking as a primatologist, it puts them on notice. It puts them on edge. It truly makes them comfortable because they're like, well, I cannot dismiss this person because I know that they understand the basics of it. So that's been, I have to wonder if that will not be my biggest contribution. It's just making my former colleagues uncomfortable.
I think you'll have many contributions, but I certainly think that's a huge one. And it reminds me of, like when you look at other social movements and how changes happen throughout history, I think one of the fastest moving social movements in history was the gay liberation movement. And there's certainly a lot of tactics involved in how we have like radically as a country come to be much more accepting of the gay community. But one of the ways that that worked so well, I think, was the coming out movement and people coming out to their friends and family. And all of a sudden it's like a similar thing where it's like, well, I thought I could hate this whole group of people, but now it's like my sister, now it's my cousin. And like, I love this person, I respect this person. I can't just like hate this person. So maybe I shouldn't hate all these people. And I think that there could be a very similar dynamic that ends up happening with you, Lisa, and with like other folks like you, and that it's like all of a sudden they can't just dismiss the message based on the messenger because they respect and understand like the messenger, knows what they're talking about and, is like someone who they identify with. And it really, really changes that conversation. I think there's just, I really hope that like what you have done inspires other people down the road to do the same thing. And I think that would could be a huge shift in this movement.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for a very enlightening presentation. Couple of things. What's being done in other countries, if anything?
And you mean like in terms of animal research or advocates?
Advocacy, yeah. Animal rights work, that's my first part of the question. I mean, I can look it up later. But second thing is, I haven't thought out this question well, but how far can one go to exposing what labs and factory farms and private businesses are doing without crossing the line legally? You know what I mean? In terms of, I don't know what the law would be, but do you get what I'm saying here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I mean, we would all love to just say, this company is doing that and they are so-and-so, but then there's got to be some kind of a legal line where you're moving into, where you've gone too far. Anyway.
Well, I can't really speak to what other countries do in terms of animal advocacy because it varies from country to country by what's going on in that particular country. In terms of what information you can expose, that also depends on what industry you're talking about. With animal research, there's a lot of stuff you can get through Freedom of Information Act requests, and there's stuff that's published. So I've gotten a lot of information from the UW through FOIA requests, and that's mine to choose what I want to do with it. I can publish that on the web, and I've shared it around to other people, and I do intend to put it in a more public place as long as I can get it in a readable format. And that's like, they can't stop me from doing that because that's public information. There's stuff that's published on all the stuff that Rise for Animals has that's published on the Arlo site that I put a link to. That's all publicly available information that they got through FOIA requests or from the USDA APHIS website. That's all stuff you can expose. Amy knows full well what the animal ag industry has tried to do to shut down people from talking about what they do.
Yeah, it boils down to, we do still have free speech in this country at this moment in time anyways. And so I always advocate people use that. And if you're telling the truth about what's happening to these animals, if you're, as long as you're not telling super lies, you're completely protected by First Amendment. And if you're just talking about your opinions on what's happening to animals in labs, you can say that wherever, whenever you want. That is your First Amendment right to share your opinion. And I definitely encourage people to do that. And I also sadly am not well versed in what is happening too much internationally. I'm connected with some activists internationally. A lot of their activism has slowed down during a lot of the lockdowns and pandemic. A lot of countries, their lockdowns are even more serious than what they have been in the US. And so that's really stifled a lot of their activism. But there is a lot of activists, especially like in the UK, that focus on animals and labs issues, and definitely around the world too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've just got something to add to Sean's question there. You might want to check out the Huntington Life Sciences work that happened, ALF did in the UK, and then it spread over to the US. So they did a lot of really good work. But in terms of, you're dead right, in terms of activism, I'm in Dublin in Ireland at the moment, and we're in our second lockdown, and we're restricted to 5 kilometers. So if you go outside that, you've got a very hefty monetary fine. So it's just, there's not a lot we can do at the moment, but we've decided what we're going to try and do. We were very successful in getting fur farming banned here last year. So now that you were saying with the COVID vaccine, because of the political pressure to try and get the vaccine pushed out as quickly as possible, a lot of the human trials happened quicker than they normally would. We're now trying to use this as sort of political leverage to get like friendly socialist parties in the government to try and push for that type of testing to become the norm and to get the other ones banned. But we're coming into a brick wall at the moment here where we don't know, we don't have the information that you've given us now in relation to how animal testing happens in the EU or in Ireland. And we need that information to go in with like forearmed and forewarned when we come up against the lobbyists and the labs and whatever, when they try and argue back. So I don't know if you would have any information, or you would know of any groups that would have information in relation to the EU.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. I'm not familiar with the kinds of like, yeah, I mean, like in the US here, like I mentioned, like a lot of what the information that we're able to get is through, you know, laws we have here, like freedom of information. So I don't know if there's any sort of equivalent, but another way that we can find out about what's happening inside labs here is just through published papers and looking on like Google Scholar. And if you can probably do some search terms for, you know, your city or labs that you know about, and you might be able to find papers that they've put out about their research, and that can still be illuminating. So maybe that'll be helpful. There's also, and sometimes those papers are behind paywalls, but there's usually ways around that students can access, or there's this great pirate woman who has a website that has most papers online. It's like sci-hub something. But anyways, yeah, maybe looking at published papers. I don't know if anyone else on the call has other information that might be helpful about EU stuff. I know there are, like, Cruelty Free International might have some information that's helpful. And I know there's in the EU, there's SOCO, who has done investigations, but I don't know if they have more of that specific information, what's happening right now to animals there.
Yeah, we have tried to get some freedom of information documents over here before, but usually what ends up happening is we get a document that's just completely blacked out. So
Okay.
there's somebody with a black marker and just covered everything, any little bit of valuable information. So it's basically a waste of our time and money.
Yeah, and that happens to us sometimes as well. And some of that stuff, at least here, they legally can redact sometimes, and well, quite often they'll redact things that they aren't allowed to be. But you know, in order to fight that, you have to sue them. So you have to have an attorney willing to work with you, and that's going to cost money. And a lot of times, you know, eventually we're successful, but And like a lot of times it takes a lot of time and money. And I'm sure folks like probably Rachel and maybe Lisa as well have been familiar with a common tendency of labs in the US is that they just stretch those legal battles on for so long, even if they know they're going to lose and that they have to give us that information, but they string it along for so long that by the time they have to give you the documents unredacted, it's been 4 years. And so now, like, getting anyone to care about, you know, this awful thing that happened 4 years ago, people are like, why are you just talking about this now? So it's certainly not perfect here by any means either.
Harry found a link to that that website you're talking about. It's in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know how I only learned about this website like a year ago, but if you're trying to do some research and trying to access published papers that are behind paywalls, it really has, you basically just copy and paste the name of the paper, and she has just most of them unless it's super recent. So that's a way that you can still read that information. This is just like random people who are dedicated to open information, which is also, yeah, a wonderful thing.
Great, thank you.
We only have a couple more minutes. So does anybody else have any other questions? I don't want to take up too much people's evening.
Hi, I do.
Yeah, I had a question. Will this slideshow be available to us online?
Well, Amy's gonna mail it to me, and then we'll mail it out to everybody. Well, we have all your emails since you registered, so we'll email it out to all the attendees.
Thank you.
I have a question. So this is it's kind of a silly question. It's really basic. How can I help, like, without being completely new in this whole thing? Like, you know, how can I help? Just start.
Well, there's a couple different, RISE has a campaign against Marshall right now. So if you go over to their website and look at some of it, they have action alerts all the time. So that's one way, and they're gearing that up. PETA has one that is working against the University of Washington, and NARN's helping with that. So there's stuff going on locally. I'm trying to find the link for that one. So there is ways that you can plug in. There's also monthly meetings that the university has, their institutional animal care and use committee, the IACUC. They have that on the third Thursday of every month. And so if you're signed up for NARN's email list, then you will get notified of that. We put that in our weekly email. It's on our events page of our website. So we list things, you know, what's going on there. We'll certainly share things that PETA is doing with the campaign. There's leafleting opportunities, but I have noticed that the more people that attend those IACUC meetings and you get 2 minutes at the end to speak, then I really do think that they're starting to get a little uncomfortable because they're not used to the public attending those meetings. Because before COVID, you had to go into a room at the university, and it starts at 2:30 on a Thursday when a lot of people are at work. So it's pretty hard for the average person to attend those meetings. But now that they're over Zoom, there's a lot more people that are able to attend and say something at, 2 minutes at the end. So there's, certainly a variety of ways, whether you want to leaflet or write emails or attend a meeting. It kind of depends on your comfort level. But I would recommend signing up for NARN's weekly email and then checking out the work that RISE is doing.
Yeah, and we'll be having some, I think it all depends on your comfort level and what kind of action you want to take to help animals in labs, and whatever that looks like. Well, NARN has a lot of different kinds of opportunities, which is really awesome. And then if you follow RISE on Facebook or subscribe to our email list, we'll be having a lot of different types of actions to help with our campaign against Marshall Bioresources that include everything from like protests to just calling the right people at the right time, and emails and social media actions. So, you know, hopefully there's ways, depending on what kind of activism you're interested, that you can get plugged in.
Okay, thank you. I want to get involved. So thanks.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's awesome to have you. Yeah, it's great.
Anyone else got a question? I'm just gonna put the link to sign up for NARN's email real quick here, so you don't have to look for it. I think there was, Mike, when people sign up on the Action Network thing, was there an option to sign up for the NARN email? I forget.
Yes, it gave people an option to sign up for the NARN email when they did that, when they registered, if they went through the Action Network registration.
All right, let me find that link real quick.
Although it's probably better to just do the subscribe on our website if they just want to do that.
There's that link. It's just easy enough to go to, and we actually send an email out every other week, so you won't get one. I'm so used to saying weekly email, but we now send it out every 2 weeks. Okay, well, thank you very much, Amy. I really appreciate you doing that presentation. You're always so informative, and just another plug for RISE is they've been doing some webinars like every couple, I don't know, like once a month or something, that are really interesting, to like how to do social media better, how to, you know, like a lot of things to help you be a better advocate. So even though I've been doing this for a while, I still find those interesting, and like I get a little new tips every now and then.
Oh, well, it's awesome that you can get something from it because you've been doing this stuff for so long, but I appreciate that. Yeah, the next one, February, is about recruitment and getting people drawn into the movement, just getting more people involved and keeping them around. So yeah, if that's of interest to folks, just head over to Rise for Animals, or feel free to email me with any questions, or if you need help getting pointed in the right direction too. And thanks so much for NARN for hosting this and all the awesome events you've been doing during the pandemic. It's awesome to still be connecting with folks.
We're trying.
I've been kind of seeing you more than I had before the pandemic in a virtual way. So
I know, it's pretty funny. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I think it's pretty cool we had someone from Ireland call in. So thanks. All right.
I appreciate it, especially with a name like Sean. Do I look like a Sean, Carl?
You look like whatever name you have.
Thank you, Amy and Rachel. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.